way? I mean, are we doing enough sort of on the supermarket shelves to inform people what they're buying is sustainable and humane?
Just answering that specific one, Chairman. Yes,
yeah.
I think there is a commitment from supermarkets, retailers, and quite a lot of people in the fishing communities to try and make sure that what people are buying is understood and is sustainable and isn't impacting whales, dolphins, or anything other creatures. Whale and Dolphin Conservation has a project at the moment which is working with supermarkets in the UK, and we've started now working with supermarkets in the US. And alongside the Sustainable Fishery Alliance and the RSPB, we've been auditing supermarkets' supply chains and looking at where and what is happening in terms of a whole range of species that are potentially by-caught. But the essence of that approach is not just then to cut the fishermen off. It's actually to work with those fishing communities to look at alternative gears, find different techniques. And that extends all the way then to working with, for example, we have a project in Scotland working with the Scottish creel fishery with Nature Scotland and that community, where we've been running a study looking at what entanglements are happening, often with minke whales there, and then looking at alternatives. And that really is lessons we've learned from the US, where they have the Marine Mammal Protection Act, where you have take reduction teams, where it actually brings all the stakeholders together to find solutions. And I've invariably found that if you can get people committed to the same objective, fishermen don't want to have whales and dolphins or seals in their nets. It's expensive. It's not good for them in terms of their reputations. And often they want to see animals protected at sea. They rely on the ocean being healthy. And if you can bring those stakeholders together, we can find solutions to some of these problems. So, sorry, that's a very quick answer. That yes, there is a commitment.
From the United States in terms of the UK government's approach. Are you saying that we could maybe learn from the US in terms of what we've already had to protect seals because we want to sell them salmon? So, is there more we could learn from the US in terms of?
I think we can. I think if you look at what we have to deal with in the UK, we're looking at a series of pieces of legislation which all interconnect but don't quite add up to a whole. So, for example, if I describe it as you're in your house, you've got the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which is actually giving you that sort of protection out to about 12 miles. You step outside your house up to your garden gate, you've got the Wildlife and Countryside Act, then you've got the Conservation of Habitats and Species Regulations 2017. Beyond your gate, i.e. out from the 12 to the 200, you've got the Conservation of Offshore Marine Habitats and Species Regulations. Alongside that, we have guidance on noise, we have guidance on bycatch, we have initiatives on all of those subject areas. We have CITES, which protects us from whale and dolphin products coming in, though we still have the situation that we can actually have whale meat products move through UK ports, not landed, but you move through UK ports. And we haven't been able to do anything about that yet, even though there's been a commitment from government for several years now to try and address that issue, because that helps incentivise the transport of whale meat from places like Iceland and Norway through to Japan, and we need to do something about that. But if you think about all those pieces of legislation all trying to add up, in the US we have the Marine Mammal Protection Act. What it does is it brings certainty of process, both for the fishing community, the conservation community, and also for industry as a whole. I think we're
maybe straying into later. Sorry, that was my fault for sort of
but I'll put that as a little hook in there, ready to come back to that question.
Yes, thank you. Lucy, back to the original question, is the government policy effective?
I think just to sort of add on, sort of feeding into this area, there were 2 points that I wanted to raise, which I feel would be sort of quick wins for the government to be effective in the policy. I know we're going to discuss some of it, so I'll come in on the bycatch mitigation initiative in the bycatch section questioning. Okay. But the two parts which would be simple and very effective. The first one is for seals, and we've discussed seals quite a lot, and you've acknowledged sort of the amazing steps that have happened around stopping killing of seals around fish farms. However, seals are also very much impacted by disturbance. So by including them into the Wildlife and Countryside Act, to make the intentional or reckless disturbance and or harassment of the seals an offence, like it is for whales and dolphins, would be a wonderful step forward in their protection. The second point I wanted to raise, which Chris did just touch on there, is to ban the transit of cetacean products through UK ports and also ensure that the ivory ban covers the teeth and tusks of cetaceans. And that would, both of those would protect them in the UK, but also the global protection of marine mammals.
Do we know how much comes through? Is it large quantities or?
Do you have those figures?
In terms of the last few years, we don't have any whale meat actually coming into British ports and then out again, but we have record and we can send you the details of what's happened previously. It appeared as a issue, I think, during the Brexit debate, where one side used it quite a lot in terms of trying to say this is something that we could do after we'd left the EU. Unfortunately, nothing has happened since we've left the EU.
In that case, then.
Benefits of Brexit.
Yeah. Can I just turn now to the precautionary principle, and to what extent should we apply? I mean, I think, in my view, the precautionary principle is a great thing if you do it for the right reasons, not just because you've no data on which to base your action and you think, let's just do it as a precaution. I mean, are there areas where we need to be more sensitive to the precautionary principle and take further steps to protect these species, even when, as we heard in the first session, some of the data is not as comprehensive as we'd like it to be?
Yeah. Sorry, if you're happy.
Yes, please.
Continue. Yeah, so I think, as Carol said, we do need to monitor and we need to gain more data, but actually that shouldn't be an excuse for not taking action. Okay. We know the trends in quite a few of these populations. We know now increasingly that whales and dolphins, for example, play a really critical role in ecosystems as engineers. We know that they move nutrients around in the ocean. If we look back in terms of fishing, I think Professor Callum Roberts looked at 1889, and he looked at the fishing effort that time against now. We were taking in twice as much fish at that time from sailboats. We didn't have the powered units, but they were out there. We are now 17 times the effort in terms of our fishing. The ocean has been degraded. You mentioned this issue of Sentinel Species. We have an incredible group of creatures here who are highly complex. Rob touched on it in terms of their social complexity. We know now that cetaceans, certain species, actually have culture. They actually pass on culture from one to the other. And for all the gentlemen in the room, I'm afraid they are mostly matriarchal societies. The grandmothers are the ones who actually keep a lot of knowledge. We know now that if we lose some of those significant individuals, we often then, the power analysis, when you apply it to a population, it drops off incredibly fast. So it turns out we have to think about protecting cultural populations, not just species and populations. So if you take the approach that we've got through the UK dolphin and porpoise strategy, it's actually very much welcomed in terms of its intent, but in terms of its aspirations, it's great. But there's no targets in there. There are no timelines in there. And again, I compare this to the American system where there are goals and targets. We have something which is aspirational, but unless it has targets and goals, it really won't account to anything. It came out March 21. Of course, we had COVID, and that's held us back. But there were commitments in there to start setting up steering committees, start turning terms of reference. I'm
going to turn to that now, actually. So if we could, obviously that consultation was launched in March 2021 between DEFRA and the devolved administrations. I mean, what's your analysis of the proposal in that consultation? Were they things that we should have definitely carried forward? We've had the pandemic and all sorts of things in the meantime, but there are plenty of excuses not to make progress. But do you feel like that's a good direct line of direction to be taking? I
think the aspirations are good. Yeah. I think limiting it to only a certain number of species, it's called the UK Dolphin and Porpoise strategy, but actually it includes one of the great whales, which is the minke whale. Really, we should be looking at that 17 to 27 species that actually we do find in UK waters. You can't just look at them. It doesn't go into enough of the granular level. You can't just take a species across the North Atlantic and say, we're going to protect those. As Rob was referring to earlier, I think, in terms of you've got to be more granular in its assessment. We can't use it to bypass marine protected area strategies. It has to complement things that we already have. If we could have the actual actions, if we could actually have goals for it, and these are the things, again, referring to our American colleagues, When you sit down with stakeholders where they actually have targets that they're going for, productivity seems to go up enormously. When aspirations are too widely described, then you can get a lot of talk but very little action. And the community in the UK is absolutely wanting to get on and see action. Can I just say at this stage, the DEFRA teams who've worked on these and across the board on cetacean issues have been absolutely superb. Barrett will remember back in his days as a minister as well. There's been some excellent people in the DEFRA teams, and we've actually benefited from the fact that the old adage of promoting civil servants as soon as they get good at something to some another department, there's been a little bit of slowing of that, which means actually competency is being built up, understanding of the issues and that ability to give really good professional advice to ministers. And it's been a topic that lots of ministers, any government of any colour and description, has agreed with in terms of protecting cetaceans. But that group of civil servants have been great. They don't always agree with what we ask of them, but they always listen, and we've always found that they've made sure ministers get the full spectrum of information that they need to make decisions, and for that we're extremely grateful.
Thank you. We're going to have to try and make some progress. I mean, Lucy, Mark, do you basically agree with what's been said? Or
yes. No, I mean, you're hearing us actually as one voice. It's just coming out of different faces. But I just wanted to add a little bit, because we can mix management and conservation aspirations with precaution, I think. And just to add a little bit of colour or tuning to that. So the UK's initiative for dolphins and porpoises and the minke whale is very new. So it's very difficult to evaluate how effective it's going to be yet. You know, it's almost sort of too soon for us to be able to say. But as Chris said, we obviously would like to see targets and targets set against time and so forth, and it to being more aspirational and more inclusive of the other species. And then if we think about all those species and populations where we're unsure about their status, we also now need to figure into that. Climate change is changing things very rapidly. So fish populations are changing, fish populations are moving around, the temperature of the sea is changing, and that means that we're starting to see globally cetacean populations shifting, and that has implications as well. So that, all of that together, in combination with other threats, means that we need to be taking a more precautionary approach.
Okay, understood. Thank you. Lucy, are you in agreement, or do you want to add anything?
I am in agreement, and I would like to add something, but I can be swift. And it's building on what Barry said earlier about monitoring and highlighting those really important parts. So effective and robust monitoring is required for government to meet its obligations, and it underpins all actions. So everything we're going to discuss today needs that monitoring. It's the baseline monitoring that's the essential first step in understanding cetacean and marine mammal populations and trends over time, and then informing, as you correctly said earlier, the mitigation measures. But it should not prevent precautionary action. I also want to add that it's only through the collation of data sets that a true understanding can be made. Like Mark has said about climate change, it's affecting things really rapidly. So government action should include the investment in these large-scale monitoring, such as scans, but it shouldn't be the sole focus. As with everything, it does have its limitations. I think investment in other data sets to complement these, to plug the gaps for real-time reporting, is absolutely essential. Things such as the stranding works that's done by CSIP and SMAS, but also the incredible long-term monitoring work that's done by citizen science. There's robust programs which are proven to work by researchers, by industry, and that's land-based and at sea. And you did mention, Barry, that we need some standardization of this data to make it work. There is a framework that already exists, and that's from the JNCC, the Joint Cetacean Data Programme. It's an existing framework for effective monitoring system with the sharing of data. It provides guidelines for standardization of data. And I think through the low-level continuous support, we can have a development of a real-time annual reporting on UK cetaceans through this. I sit on the governance panel for it. It's a cross-sector monitoring with the scope to bring in more partners and stakeholders outside of the UK. So I think that's a really important area to build on.
Thank you. I'd hazard a guess that the new Secretary of State and his ministers haven't necessarily got their heads fully around this consultation yet, so I'm sure somebody from DEFRA will be watching, so I hope they'll place something in front of the Minister before he arrives in front of this committee, so he's better briefed and can't just say, I'll write to him, which is never a good answer to give to any question. Barry.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you. I think that was very helpful in terms of the recommendations that we can make from this committee. And you've given me the perfect segue because I wanted to pick up on the JNCC guidelines. And whether you believe that they are adequate in terms of the mitigation of harm to marine mammals for underwater noise. I mean, I think many people don't think of cetaceans as going deaf. Perhaps you could just say how it is that they sometimes do, what the JNCC guidelines say about underwater noise, and what are the mitigation strategies that could be used.
Well, I think it lands
very much on yours, Dr. Simmons. Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Gardner. It's Mr. Simmons. You also promoted me.
Doctor here.
No, it shouldn't. I didn't know that.
You've been upgraded as well.
Reached forward and crossed it out. I should be, but I'm not. The issue is very technical, and it's very much a key issue of our time, because obviously the noise threat to cetaceans interfaces with fisheries mitigation activities such as pingers, our aspirations for marine renewable development within our waters and possibly beyond, and even the cutting edge of warfare at this time because of the powerful low frequency and other sonars that the military are using to find each other. And it's a difficult issue because it's very hard, I think, for people to understand how significant noise is to cetaceans. The way that we normally try to express it is that we say something like, we primarily perceive our world through vision, they primarily perceive their world through listening to it, through sound, and some of them also make noises to help them, like a sort of form of echolocation, etc. So we introduce a lot of noise into the seas where it travels much better than it does in air, so that provides another problem. And then we try and make all sorts of analogies like the cocktail room effect, or if, like me, you're starting to get increasingly deaf, you can't hear things anymore if you're in a place where there's lots of background noise. And that will affect them over distance. Species like the blue whale probably used to be able to communicate with other individuals across entire ocean basins, and probably can't do that now because of the low frequency rumbling that's going on, probably mainly from shipping, and we might want to come back to addressing shipping. Then we have very acute noises, such as those military noises, such as seismic survey noises, such as pile driving, and Rob, I think, touched briefly on this for the harbour porpoise, and there are going to be species-specific differences. When the JNCC first came out with its seismic guidelines, they were state-of-the-art. It was, and it was the first time, as far as I can remember, that any country had tried to come out with something that would offer some attempt to mitigate. We've learnt a lot since then, and amongst the things that we've learnt is how far noise may affect marine mammals. And we're still refining that. We're still looking at that on a global basis. There are still measurements to be made. There are still things to be understood for different species. So it was state-of-the-art. Now we know a lot more. And I will raise a flag of concern that if observers are based on boats that are the source of the noise, they may not be able to perceive effects which are so distant from the boat but are still significant. And with your permission, because it is an issue of real importance and it's very, very technical, we'd like to come back to you on this one in writing after we've had more of a chance to consult, look at the current guidelines, I think there's more than one set, and see how they've been revised But it's such an important issue, so we're really grateful that you've raised it.
I think that would be extremely helpful if you could put that to us in writing. Thank you. You've all outlined how important it is that you adopt a precautionary approach in this area. And so I wanted to just ask you about the way in which the MMOA, the Marine Mammals Observer Association, has suggested that there should be a greater use of shutdowns in industrial operations, and indeed trying to almost give advance warning to cetaceans beforehand to clear them from the area. Would that be one aspect of the precautionary principle that you would welcome? Do you think it would be effective? Is there any evidence that it is effective?
With respect, I think I'd like to come back to that one, and we'll take it on board in our written response, because I think it's part of that overall picture.
Super. Chris, you wanted to just...
I join with Mark, which is this is a rapidly changing area. But Whale and Dolphin Conservation has advocated previously for the use of noise limits. And what would be potentially useful is to bring in written form again to the committee work that's been done in Germany and Belgium, where actual noise limits are used, and then the type of monitoring. So if you take the guidance as it stands at the moment, is there's a lot of monitoring in the construction phase, say, of offshore. There's nothing afterwards. And yet we then have quite a lot of noisy environments once we have offshore. And we all recognise that we need more renewables going into place. It's something the country has to commit to. What we want that to be done is to answer one ecological challenge. We don't want to create another one. So I think there is a lot of learning coming.
We could, of course, do it onshore.
We could do it onshore. And from a cetacean point of view, I would fully support onshore. There is a lot of learning, I think, coming across. So we know, for example, having a, say, 160 decibel limit with a peak of about 190, we can map out to about 750 in terms of what the threshold impacts are on cetaceans. We know that goes out to about 8 kilometres, and we still have what we would classify as disturbance. So these are significant impacts on species where, again, we don't know too much. And under the Marine Strategy Framework, none of these species have good environmental status at the moment. So we want to make sure they're still there, because they are contributing to a healthy ocean. We need them in there. There's one paper just come out which has looked at the contribution of cetaceans in the UK as carrying on their bodies about 2 megatons of carbon, and they're moving something like 90,000 tons of nitrogen around in terms of feeding the baseline of the food production in our waters. We can't afford to drive them further offshore. We need them there in order to have healthy, productive seas.
Great, thank you. Look, the chairman has been very kind to me because he's allowed me to double up my international question with my domestic question, because I have to go to the urgent question that's coming up on Iran. So can I sort of get you to switch your hats or your thought processes and focus on the CBD COP15 later on this year and the Global Biodiversity Framework that's going to be produced there? Obviously, the Global Ocean Alliance is pushing for this 30% of the world's oceans by 2030 target. How important do you believe that to be? And how essential is the High Seas Treaty in achieving it, and how important would that be for marine mammal conservation?
I can do a really quick intro.
Great.
It's wonderful to have aspirations. We didn't make the 20% by 2020. UK protected areas, at the moment we claim that we're protecting about 40%. Actually, we don't have enough management conservation plans in place to really claim more than about 4 to 8% in terms of the protection. The Benyon review was excellent in terms of introducing further the concept of highly protected areas, but we actually really need to make them work. As the UK, it's all well and good us going around and saying this area is protected halfway around the world that we have as an overseas territory, but unless we actually can also export the expertise in terms of how you protect that, and personally I think that's an area of growth of industry for this country, that we can develop the expertise that can help other countries in order to protect their oceans. But we really have to get it sorted out here first, and then we can really live up to that 30 by 30. But actually, 30 by 30 is a great aspiration, and we should be going for it.
Thank you. So I'm going to try and put words in your mouth in terms of the response of this committee and the recommendations, that global leadership in that aspiration is excellent, but that global leadership will only come from doing it properly in our own domestic sphere. And at the moment, you're conscious that we have not done it properly in our own domestic sphere. Is that a fair characterization of what you said?
I think that's a very fair characterization.
And therefore, one of the recommendations that it would be helpful for this committee to make would be in increasing the implementation and securing the actual protection of those marine protected areas that we've designated.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I think if this was Perry Mason, that would be leading the witness, but I think it's certainly...
Absolutely.
Well, as long as you don't put me in a wheelchair.
They're not complaining, though. They're
It's
not
written
complaining.
down in here.
Yeah, great. Look, you've talked about the UK's goals ahead of the next meeting of the Conference of the Parties. Specifically for marine mammal conservation, what should those goals be, aside from 30 by 30?
I have a very quick one that others can then comment on. I think championing the role of the ocean and its inhabitants as nature-based solutions to the climate change, linking CBD to the UNFCCC in terms of the opportunities, again, for the UK to position itself. I mean, I was disappointed at the end of the UNFCCC in Glasgow that a lot of small island states seemed to drop off the agenda. I think the UK did a good job of trying to get countries together at the table. But a lot of those countries have major pieces of ocean which are providing incredible ecological services to all of us. The ocean's absorbing something like 98.5% of all the carbon atmosphere flux that's taking place. We need to be able to value those oceans. The natural capital that's involved in those can help us elevate some of those countries on the world stage. And coming back to the leadership, the UK can position itself in a new way in terms of facilitating these countries to understand what their oceans are doing, not just for them, but for us. So yes, I think CBD, linking it back to the UNFCCC and linking those two, the ocean has an incredible capacity to help us. It's been and whales have been our ally for years, even though we took 3 million of them out of the ocean in the 1900 to 2000.
Yeah. Yes, Mr. Simmons.
I hope, thank you, Mr. Gardner. I hope we can go back to other international agreements as well, because I wouldn't want to lose the fact that the UK has shown, in my experience over the last quarter of a century or so, tremendous leadership in the international conventions where I've worked. And I'm also very mindful that in just a couple of days, the Whaling Commission will open up its first meeting for 4 years, delayed by the pandemic, and there is a team of folks sent there by the UK who will be looking at some of issues that we've already touched on, including, for example, where Aboriginal subsistence and commercial whaling interface, and these are different things, and we might, I will give you a slightly different list of species and where they fit, and we might come back to you in writing on that as well, just to clarify that for the committee. I mean, we also have a regional agreement, ASCO bands, which is a daughter agreement of the Convention for Migratory Species, and ASCO bands is the agreement for small cetaceans of the North and Baltic Seas and contiguous Atlantic area, or something like that, not to be confused with a prison invented by J.K. Rowling. But this is a regional agreement now which has significant importance, of course, because it brings together countries which are both within the EU and outside of the EU. And again, the UK has shown great leadership, great determination in holding that body together. It's also a body which has interesting roles. It has, for example, written to the Faroes recently about their extraordinary take of Atlantic white-sided dolphins. So this happened roughly a year ago. They took 1,400 Atlantic white-sided dolphins in one single hunt, in one single day. This is a species which is protected here and protected in the rest of Europe, and it's an extraordinary thing to have happened. And
normally they catch just a handful. Normally it's just a handful, isn't it? I mean, it was bizarre how many they seemed to catch.
It was bizarre. Unfortunately, Chairman, recently they've also taken almost 100 bottlenose dolphins in a single hunt. So here we have a situation where we're trying to protect them in the UK and in Europe, and they are being hunted. And this is not a hunt which is recognised as Aboriginal subsistence. This is something else which is going on there. And we in the UK have an opportunity to talk to people in the Faroes, particularly as we now have trade agreements with them in that direction, to follow up on this and try to persuade them that really this is something that they no longer need to do. I'm digressing slightly. International agreements, tremendous work at the Convention for Migratory Species, tremendous work at the International Whaling Commission. Watch this space, it's going to get very lively, and at ASCO.
You haven't answered my question about High Seas Treaty. And how are we going to achieve 30 by 30? Great aspiration. How are we going to achieve it without a High Seas Treaty?
Yeah, no, I think the UK should be championing another round of the negotiations on the BBNJ. Again, the UK could take an absolute leadership position here, because we're talking about an area of unregulated fishing and an area of unregulated extraction, and yet it's the common heritage of us all, to use a cliche. The UK, again, could be positioning itself as that honest broker in terms of protecting that area of waters, which actually then has huge benefits for everybody, all the other countries in the world.
Does it need to provide funding in order to do that, to get the next round going before the CBD COP?
I think it could well... You said earlier, everyone comes before you and asks for more money. I think, we can make sure that our DEFRA team is maintained and is able to engage with this on a long-term basis. It's not just about achieving the treaty, it's what comes next. I think, secondly, having the money to be able...
So that is a very specific recommendation about the maintenance of that team and the importance that it would have in eventually achieving the objective of 30 by 30 and the High Seas Treaty.
I'm not sure how the individuals would react to me saying stay in place, but I would say in terms of the expertise that DEFRA has developed in terms of these areas, let's not lose that. Let's make sure that we can have continuity of that knowledge base as it moves forward. Yes, I think there's an amazing opportunity for soft power for this country in terms of positioning itself, in terms of being able to invest. There are countries where if we could have investment in evaluating the ecological services of whales around their oceans, where they can revalue their oceans in terms of what they're providing, the services they're providing, it could be an amazing thing for this country as it leads forward.
Thank you. Lucy, anything to add to that?
I fully support that. A very quick one, if it's okay, just to come back with your noise one prior to that. I think it's important that the UK government doesn't forget to look at that baseline monitoring. So you're right, noise causes huge impact and shutdowns could be very helpful to stop that. However, by looking at that baseline information, having a cohesive, joined-up monitoring network around the UK with real-time reporting could help inform where these areas, or inform important areas where such activity may not be best placed.
Thank you, and I do assure you no discourtesy is intended, but I do have to go to the...
Thank you, Barry. Thank you. And just in case anyone was watching at home, heard us refer to 30 by 30, that is the aspiration to protect 30% of the oceans by 2030, which is certainly very ambitious, but no reason not to make progress towards that. We're actually getting a little bit pushed for time, so if we can try and make some progress short.
I will try to be
extremely quick. And
if I could just ask the panel if you can make your responses succinct as well, that might help. The UK government recently published its bycatch mitigation initiative. How far does this go to addressing the issue of bycatch? Lucy, do you want to come in first?
Yes, I will. So, as we've heard, globally and within the UK, bycatch kills more marine mammals than any other threat. It's a multi-taxa issue, and the Bycatch Mitigation Initiative, the BMI, set out to do everything correctly to help mitigate this threat. It's absolutely fantastic that the UK has this, and the document includes all the critical areas required and that needs to be considered to ensure that it can meet its aim of minimising or eliminating bycatch.
How far does this go to addressing the issue of bycatch?
The vision and the rhetoric are there, but unfortunately it's the action that is missing. And it's the action, not the words, that's going to make the difference, that will protect them. An incredible amount of time and effort has gone into this, and we applaud the DEFRA team for that. But without specific, time-bound or measurable actions, it's merely a list of suggestions. So I was going to say our advice for government is quite simple. We have the information that we need to act, so we need effective monitoring action in place.
I might be coming on to other parts of this with the rest of my questions. Okay. So, but if we don't at the end of the question and you think we've missed anything, perhaps, Chairman, we could collect that in writing. Yep. So I'm going to go to another panel member now with my next bit. Should the BMI be underpinned by a set of clear targets to reduce bycatch numbers? And if so, what should these targets be? Chris?
Yes.
And what should these numbers be?
It depends on because the BMI seeks to attack all issues of types of bycatch. You can't just answer that immediately, just, I'm afraid, off the cuff. What we need to do is look at each of the fisheries operations and work cooperatively to identify how to reduce those down and set those targets. But those targets then become the motivating factors. Solutions come when you're trying to meet those kind of targets. So I would say it depends on the fishery, depends on the species.
When you say the fishery, are you talking about species targeted or method of capture?
Usually method of capture, and the animals which are actually getting by-caught. So we need to look at that in the whole and then set targets for each of those.
Excuse me, if I buy dolphin-friendly tuna, does that mean no dolphin is ever caught by that fisherman, or they have a level below which they'll accept a certain amount of bycatch?
Well, so if you look at the Eastern Tropical Pacific, Whale and Dolphin Conservation sat on the panel for many years, which was the Infractions Committee, which had fishermen on and others on. It had a target to reduce down to 5,000 and then a commitment to reduce below 5,000 to zero. So it wanted zero mortality. It also incorporated zero impact on those cetaceans. So it had a staged approach, but what it tried to do was not block off markets and act as an incentive for change to happen. So the US took a position of boycotting, say, tuna coming out of Mexico. And personally, I think that had advantages at the beginning, but had disadvantages when you came to incentivize the fishermen to continue, because all they did was switch their market and move it to Europe at that time. So if you're asking me, is dolphin safe or dolphin friendly, they kind of have two different meanings. And so the names can be covering a multitude of sins in the way they describe what happens.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
Sorry. No, that's fine, Chairman. I'm happy to share my question with you. We're a good team. So I'm now going to go to Mark for the next bit. And can I emphasise, if any of you do have anything to add, because we're short of time, then I'm sure we can always accept it in writing. Okay. So Mark, next bit. My favourite subject. Should restrictions be placed on certain fishing gear, such as gill nets, to aid bycatch reduction? And what impact would that have on the fishing sector?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. That's a very hot potato. Thank you so much. I did a little exercise recently to actually inform the Bycatch Mitigation Initiative of the International Whaling Commission, where with a colleague I looked all around the world for examples of where bycatch action had actually led to an improved situation. And we came up with examples from the United States. I know we seem to be a little bit fixated on the United States during this meeting. That's quite interesting, and there may be reasons for that. But the examples were where the gill nets had been removed, the porpoise population had recovered. Now, we have critically endangered porpoise populations around Europe, not in UK waters at the moment. But what we were looking for was what could we put in place that would be expected to bring, a benefit, for example, for the Baltic harbour porpoise. And the removal of gill nets would be expected, based on the work in the States, to bring an improvement to that population.
Can I just ask you to expand on this question? Is it as a result of the porpoises were being caught by gill nets, or is it the fact that as the fishermen were displaced, there was more fish available to encourage the porpoises to come into that area to feed?
I think that the answer is that it's because the porpoises were no longer being caught in the gill nets. I mean, there is... I realise that this is a problem for fishermen, and I realise it isn't necessarily desirable for fishermen to lose a particular milieu.
But to reason, is there any evidence to prove that that was the case?
Well,
because
I'd have to bring the papers before you, which we could do.
There is evidence. You could send it in to us,
sure.
Because I'm sure if we asked a fisherman, they would say it's because we're not operating, so our boats are not generating that much noise. There's no fishing gear there, and so the porpoises would congregate in that area. So I think we need to be absolutely clear before we take it as gospel.
Well, we're back to the precautionary principle in terms of being absolutely
clear. That's yes,
issue,
we are.
You asked, what the implications are for the fisheries.
Absolutely.
I don't know exactly what the implications will be with fisheries. I think one would hope, me, would hope that alternative forms of fishing, could then be practiced. I think that the operators of gill net focused vessels could probably find alternative methods, and hopefully these could be advertised as being more environmentally sound and sensitive, and then the consumers could recognise this.
Can I just go back, I think, to you, Chris? Would noise abatement attachments like pingers on these nets act as a preventer from the bycatch, in your opinion?
Yeah, I'm going to say it's a complex answer. I mean, several studies around the world have indicated that in certain circumstances with certain species, they can be effective. In other places, I think Rob referred to them, these are smart creatures. And one study showed that in the first year of use, yes, cetaceans moved away. In the second year, cetaceans started to fully start to re-engage. And in the third year, it was kind of ringing the dinner bell. There are situations where fishermen have worked in cooperation with cetaceans. I've seen it in Iceland, actually, off the coast of Iceland with a herring fleet, working with the orcas to actually track where the fish is and following the orcas, who then they leave the nets in the water for the orcas actually to bring in their young and take off some of the fish which is stunned falling over the side. So in terms of those kind of acoustic devices, it is not an easy... I haven't got an easy answer for you to say put them on and it's fine.
Okay, thank you. And Chairman, thank you for letting me go on a little bit longer.
No, thank you.
And the final part, how can we constructively work with the men and women who carry out fishing activities on these issues? Should they be offered incentives to participate in bycatch mitigation trials? And, do you know of any that are ongoing at the moment? So, Lucy?
Yeah.
And then I'll let Rob and Mark come in.
The simple answer is yes. And there are projects that are already being delivered which do exactly that. And the government needs to invest in these to expand them, such as the Scottish Entanglement Alliance, the alternative gear projects. We can see how bringing together all of these stakeholders and the fisher people have a real interest in this and have really driven it forwards. There's also other work done down in the southwest, looking at, especially with common dolphins and porpoises, looking at those alternative solutions. So that partnership is there, but there does need to be support of the industry to help do that. And that's support in terms financial support might be required, but resources and the expertise as well. But immediate mitigation action needs to happen in the high-risk fleets because these animals are being killed. We know the species, the locations and the gear types, and I think the government needs to act on that in real time.
Thank you very much. And gentlemen, do you have anything to add to that final?
I could add a little bit to that.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. Thank you. So the issues that we're touching on here, not only are they complicated, but there are organisations which are working very hard to try and bring forward solutions. Pingers may not be a perfect solution in all circumstances, but there may be other ways around this. So if we look to the International Whaling Commission, which may seem a strange place to look, but it has developed its conservation work so much over the years, and it has this very important bycatch mitigation initiative, which is looking at examples from all around the world and trying to amass knowledge so that we can respond. Azkabans has a similar role on this issue in the Northeast Atlantic region, and so bringing fisherfolk to the table to take part in these discussions is incredibly important. So I just want you to know that there's a lot going on. This is a tremendous focus of activity all over the world and in these agreements where the UK is a significant supporter and player.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you,
Cheryl. Dr. Hudson.
Just in follow-up, I guess in terms of the UK's role in protecting marine mammals, what is your assessment of the role played by the United Kingdom in some of these multilateral marine mammal protection initiatives? And in that sense, what is their role and are they a leader in this? So I don't know who wants to...
Yeah. Just very quickly.
Chris,
in conventions like the International Whaling Commission, the UK has, as I say, whatever government we have in power at any time, have been taking a leading position. They were very influential when we were members of the EU. They continue to be influential now. In terms of being party to Azkabans, we are one of the countries outside of the European grouping within Azkaban, so we have, again, an important role to play. The UK has often, because it's put the views of the public front and centre in terms of wanting to see an end to the exploitation of cetaceans, has often then given the political cover to other countries to line up behind and support. So it's a position which I think is popular with the public, it's popular with our decision makers, and also it puts us on the world stage in terms of the role we can take. And can I one quick comment on the whaling issue? I know in the first panel there was discussion about was whaling low down on that list. And in terms of ASW, there will be more data coming in terms of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The Russian Federation are also part of the ASW hunting. But whaling shouldn't be just seen as a group of numbers. I think whaling is about the political stance that this world is willing to accept in its relationship with nature. And what whaling does is give the cover for countries to say, yeah, it's okay to take small cetaceans as bait for other fisheries. We lose about 100,000 small cetaceans a year now in over 100 countries where loss of other things, food sources, have led to more predation taking place. Whaling acts as that sort of cover for all these other things to happen. If we say commercial takes of cetaceans is allowed, you can kill a sentient, intelligent creature that you don't need to kill. For the commercial whaling countries, this is not something they need to do anymore. It's all about political dynasties and whatever. It allows other countries to say, well, look, if it's acceptable to do that, we can do the following. How can you incentivize fishermen to say that bycatch is a problem when somebody is allowed to kill them for meat elsewhere? Luckily, I think a lot of fishermen don't want to catch them, but it fulfills that political position, and it says something about that ethical stance that we take as a society. It's been argued that we should be able to manipulate any species, do anything to anyone as human beings. It's not true. We have to learn to live in balance with the rest of the environment, and we have a shared understanding with these amazing creatures that we share this planet. And I think in protecting and saving the whales and the dolphins, we stand a real good chance of helping ourselves. So I think they're sentinel in that way, not just in terms of being indicators of what's changing in the ocean.
Thank you. That's very powerful evidence for us in terms of that, in terms of the unacceptability and the ethics of what is going on in other parts of the world. Mark, yeah. Yeah,
no, I'm grateful for your earlier comment about there's no humane way to kill a whale out at sea, and we do think that is the case. If an exploding harpoon is very well placed, then hopefully the whale is knocked out or killed very quickly, but that obviously doesn't happen in all cases. And I think that we will be hearing over the next few days about some examples of where multiple harpoons may have been deployed before the animal died, etc. And in terms of the UK's leadership, so one example of that would be within the context of the International Whaling Commission, where the UK has brought in new evidence and a new approach to welfare assessment, which looks at not just goes beyond whaling and looks at all the different things that are affecting whales and what their implications are. So an assessment tool has been developed through the UK, which will be presented and talked about, I think, as soon as Friday. So that's a good example of our leadership, the UK's leadership in this. And coming to the issue of whaling and the theoretical development of sustainable removal rates, and David Lousseau is absolutely right. These have been developed and they are as safe as they can be for the Aboriginal whaling quotas, which are delivered for a few countries. But it's a totally different thing from developing a theoretical removal rate, that's something that you can work up mathematically, to actually making sure that that's being adhered to out on the high seas. And we have no agreed whaling management regime and really no prospect of that ever being agreed with the whaling nations, which is why Japan has left the IWC and is no longer bound by any of its requirements. And Japan's whaling has been termed, pirate whaling for that. And the IWC clearly is the relevant management and conservation body. Norway and Iceland set their own quotas and are not even abiding by the rules that have been set in terms of quota delivery. So, like everything else, it's a complex topic, but it's not as simple as just working out a number of what might be removed and what might be sustainable.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. And we're going to touch more on one of the final questions about trade policy and the UK's sort of power in within that. Can I move on now into the International Maritime Organization? Do you think enough is being done via that to mitigate the harm to marine mammals caused by shipping?
I think this one falls to me again. So IMO is potentially a very important place for us to try to achieve something. And there's a sort of win-win situation with IMO. If we can slow down ships, then they will burn less fuel and they will produce less carbon, less greenhouse gas. They are less likely to bump into whales, which of course can be catastrophic, and they will also be quieter. So that's become a priority issue to take to the IMO to try and persuade this to happen. And this may relate in particular to very sensitive areas where there are large numbers of whales congregating. And there is a proposal for a particularly sensitive sea area, a PSSA, in the Mediterranean that we would certainly like to recommend that the UK supports.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And just getting down to a more granular level, we're talking about sort of shipping there. Is enough being done at country level and regions in terms of, say, recreational vessels? And I'm thinking in terms of, in the United States with manatees and speedboats and that side of things. Is there enough being done at the granular level as well?
There's a general concern, and in fact it came up at the recent Azkaban's Advisory Committee meeting across the North East Atlantic and probably beyond, that there's an increasing number of small, fast-moving watercraft. If anybody's been near the seaside, I'm sure they will have seen some of these things. And I'm not sure whether that's IMO jurisdiction or whether that's national jurisdiction, but I think we do need to look at that. And so a very fast-moving wet bike is not something which a bottlenose dolphin could outdistance. You know, there is this sort of theory that an animal like a bottlenose dolphin will disappear underwater or will go away if it doesn't want to be there. But of course, they're actually trapped at the water surface. They have to come to the water surface to breathe on a regular basis every few minutes. And so they can be chased and corralled, you know, and of course potentially hit. So we do need to think about, I think, these very small, fast-moving watercraft.
And if I may come on,
expand
on that a little bit. So you do have, under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, the intentional and reckless disturbance of cetaceans. And there is really good guidance out there that's largely followed for whale watching vessels. However, there isn't anything in place for these recreational vessels, and it is increasing, especially around the coastlines where there are vulnerable populations. I think that is something that needs a lot more attention and some legislation.
Are other countries doing anything, to your knowledge, along those lines?
Yeah, in terms of the UK and then go to international. So the Dolphin and Porpoise strategy actually talks about the potential for licensing of these kind of operations, and we would support that kind of approach because it then also protects the industry as well as protecting the various animals out there. But the US has been looking at this whole issue of recreational vessels. So we have a study off the east coast of the US which has been looking at impacts on right whales and humpbacks, and increasingly it's recreational vessels which are causing the real problem. The regulated larger vessels where we've got controls on speeds, for example. So at the Port of Boston, reducing the speed dropping the knot rate down to about 10 outside of the port has led to a great significant reduction of impacts. But it's really the recreational vessels which are now beginning to be looked at, and we need to do the same here.
And I take your point from the beginning, Lucy, as well, about adding seals to those recommendations. These are powerful recommendations that we could put in our report, so thank you. And back to you.
Yeah. I will go to Ian Burnett. I think this might have to be the last question. I think we've covered off the last bit pretty much, haven't we?
Be useful just to have a quick
okay,
point on
we do
it.
need to finish at 10:02, but so...
Thanks, Chair. I'm just going to touch on the enforcement of the treaties or lack of. So how big a problem is the lack of enforcement as it comes to international agreements on marine mammal protection? And there is a big problem. What are the causes of the problem? I'll go to you first, Chris.
So most conventions that we sign up to are not immediately binding on us unless we adopt them into our national legislation. If you take something like the International Whaling Commission, you're talking about a 1946 convention, the ICIW, which allows for objections to be taken to decisions. So Norway hunts commercially under objection. It has loopholes which were never designed to allow these things to happen, but you have scientific whaling, which was abused heavily by Japan and was previously abused by Iceland and Norway in joint measure. So it's really only pressure outside of those kind of fora where we can bring a political dynamic to the situation. CITES, we have binding legislation that we implement internally in the UK, so that actually allows us to regulate what's coming in and out. CMS, the Convention on Migratory Species, is advancing some amazing work at the moment, but again, it's not compulsory in terms of us binding at that stage, and that's a real problem. Yeah. It is a problem. International governance sometimes isn't always compatible with national sovereignty, it would appear, when it comes to the marine, and yet we've got to find a way of cooperating, which is why things like the BBNJ become even more important as we go forward.
Would you add to that, Mark? Lucy?
Well, I would only add that I think that as the biodiversity crisis deepens, more attention is being put onto the MEAs, the multilateral environmental agreements, to show that they are being effective. Now, it's not necessarily their fault, it's not necessarily the fault of the structures or the people who are administering them, but it does come down ultimately to whether or not the parties, the member nations, are following up on what it is that they've committed to. And I think that the way that the MEAs and probably the IWC, which sits just on the side of that, can help themselves, is to put in place formal assessment processes. So like everything else, they're looking at targets, they're looking at timelines, and they're saying, have we got to that point? Where have we got with this? So we've listed this species under CITES or CMS. We put it on our appendix. We've decided it's critically endangered. This means that action should then follow. Is that action following? So we've got nice examples with the Convention for Migratory Species, which has just started to list culturally significant units. So a certain population of chimpanzees and a certain population of sperm whales have been listed because they are a unique culture that needs to be protected. So the next question should be, okay, well done. What's happening? What's actually happening in practice? What's the timeline on that? So that's the kind of thing that we're now starting to work on and advocate with these agreements.
Lucy, would you like to add anything?
I think my colleagues have covered it.
Okay, fine.
Okay.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. Neil, you just wanted to add a last quick
just
point.
quickly, coming back to the UK's leadership role and your points about that governments of successive parties have been maintaining this, and it reflects the UK population's feeling about these animals, these incredibly intelligent animals, and how we value them. So in terms of that, the leadership role that the UK can make, and we'll ask these questions of ministers as well, and we have asked them before, how the UK can go into trade negotiations and also negotiations on fisheries policies when they are talking to countries like Japan, Norway, Iceland, the Faroe Islands. Is there scope for us to use some of that soft power to show the world what we feel about these animals and protecting them? Mark?
Yes.
Yes? Yeah.
Yes. I mean, we have a good history of ministers when they meet, particularly our fisheries minister, when they meet with their equivalent, the equivalent minister in Japan, Norway, Iceland, of raising these issues. I think we're very good at that. And we have a particular opportunity, I think, with the Faroe Islands at this time because of our trade agreement with them and because of the developing economic situation. And also the Faroese seem, if anything, to be going in the wrong direction. So that, adds some spice to our need to address them.
There's an opportunity for us. Yeah.
And just a classic there. We've had a situation this year where the Faroese have sold fishing rights in shared access waters for the UK to Russian vessels, which have been coming into that area. I just don't understand at this time where fish being taken out of a shared area is actually going back and generating money for the Russian Federation. Can I just say, if you look at something like a blue whale in the southern hemisphere, they transport about 88 tons of nitrogen per year to their calving grounds. Before whaling, they transferred 24,000 tons of nitrogen. This is where we can show that by starting to investigate these ecological services, we as the UK can then talk in these agreements. It's not just about the trade relationship between us, that country, and ourselves. It's the impact on all these other countries, and that's where we can also take a leadership position in representing a lot of those countries, I think, to make some real change happen.
Thank you.
And I think for that change to happen, we do need to lead by example. We can't just go in and recommend what others do. So an example, just quickly, of that is when you come to bycatch, is the UK should be making sure that all of our fishing vessels in UK waters and outside of UK waters has monitoring on board, whether that's through remote electronic monitoring or observers. By leading by example, we then have that position and that power to influence others.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Neil. And thank you to our witnesses who've once again given us some very helpful evidence, I think. And also, I think as politicians, there may be countries around the world where people don't care about whales. Their governments don't care about whales. But I think this is a country which has always seen animal welfare as front and centre in terms of politics. And I think our commitment to protecting these cetaceans and ensuring that we play our part globally as well as nationally, I think is something that this evidence session has underlined. So thank you very much indeed. Order.
The opportunity.
Order.
Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.